Module 10, Healing Emotional Eating. So in Module 9, you had the chance to start looking at coping with feelings without using food, and a few things that you had the chance to look at, pros and cons of emotional eating. Really important to understand that there are benefits to emotional eating, otherwise we wouldn't do it. So you had an opportunity to explore that for you. You also had the chance to identify emotional triggers, a really important part of this process. Lots of things go on around us and in our own heads that actually trigger a chain of events. Something happens that triggers a feeling, that feeling then triggers a cycle of thoughts. Those thoughts then exaggerate those feelings, and what then happens is we start to tap into our belief system, and then we act out of the end of it. So overeating or emotional eating is an action, and when we start to actually track back to what has triggered that action, that's when we can really start to see really clearly those sequences that we go through. And when we want to start to change or stop certain behaviours, it's really important to be very aware of the triggers and the sequence of thoughts and feelings that lead to the action. So again, an important part of this process. And then you also had an opportunity to start to look at physical sensations and where certain emotions arise physically in our bodies. So in the last module, it's all about starting to become more aware of triggers and those emotions and where they sit in your body. And this week we're going to start to look at some 3 ways in which you can start to heal your emotional eating. So if you remember in the last module, I talked about not all eating is emotional eating. Some of it is that non-attuned eating. So the work that we've been doing in the 8 modules leading up to starting to look at emotional eating. So things like not tuning into our physical hunger or our fullness cues, the way in which dieting mentality distorts and distracts us from our biological hunger, the good and bad food rules, the food police, all of that stuff that we covered in those 8 modules. So this week is about looking at healing emotional eating, and I want to talk about 3 key factors that are going to help you. And the first one is self-care, nurturance and compassion. That one speaks for itself, and that is an ongoing thread throughout the Food Freedom Club. So many of us, when we have been engaging in restrictive diets, we have come at it from a place of often self-hatred, self-criticism, self-loathing, that place of I'm not good enough, therefore I need to change. And in the years that I have been working on my own relationship with food, the one thing that I have used over and over is looking in the mirror and disgusting myself as a way of trying to control my eating, and lots of other little subtle ways like that I've done that have actually just continued to reinforce my beliefs that I'm not good enough as I am. And so the first aspect of healing emotional eating is to really work on self-care, self-nurturance and self-compassion, and I talk more about that in the training. The second bit you can have a chance to work on this week is learning to sit with your feelings. And this sounds really simple, but for so many of us we've really disconnected to our feelings. And in this week I want to sort of take you through a way of being able to start to become more attuned with what you are feeling, because often emotional eating is not so much about not feeling the feeling. It's a resistance, and it's the resistance to the feeling that creates the feeling to get bigger. And that's where we then start to use food, because we think we can't cope with those feelings. Feeling is just energy in our body, and generally it lasts for about 90 seconds. But because what happens is we get triggered, we feel a feeling, and then the brain gets involved and starts to create a story which often makes those feelings much bigger. And that's when we feel like we can't cope. And that's when things like food or procrastination or whatever the coping mechanism is that you're using kicks in. And of course, the more we do that, the more we use those coping mechanisms as a way of coping with that feeling, that becomes a bit of a pairing. So if anyone's familiar with Pavlov's dogs, where they trained the dogs, they would ring a bell and feed them. Sooner or later, after they'd conditioned them to associate the bell ringing with being fed, they would ring the bell and the dogs would still salivate even when there was no food. And it's the same thing that goes on here. The more we practice, when we feel a certain feeling, eating or procrastinating or reaching for Facebook, the more we're likely to do that, because that's how the brain works. It likes the path of least resistance. So it recognizes the trigger, it recognizes the emotion, and then it, without even really thinking, these well-worn pathways in our brain take us down that road. So really important that reading these training modules isn't going to change it. You have to take the action. You have to put these notes in your diary to practice some of these techniques, because what we have to do is we have to start to break and interrupt these patterns in your brain. So learning to sit with your feelings. I'm going to talk to you about the pause. So part of it is about recognizing when you're starting to feel an uncomfortable feeling, and instead of ignoring it and disengaging from it, you're going to almost press a pause. And at that point, you are then going to just spend a bit of time looking at what is going on. What is it you really need at that moment in time? And how can you fulfill that need? Now, this stuff takes time. Okay, the first step is being able to recognize when you have that energy shift in your body. And life's busy and we're so used to like ignoring our feelings that we kind of just have to really try and tune in with what is going on in our bodies. And this is one of those. The more you practice it, the easier it's going to become to pick up. You will know those signs, but what you've learnt to do is ignore them. So the triggers are there. It's a bit like biological hunger cues and fullness. You know, we've learnt to disassociate from them. And it's the same with feelings generally. So we've got to start getting a bit more associated with our feelings, which can feel really scary because we kind of feed ourselves a story that we can't cope. But really important to remember that the original feeling, the original alert that our body gives us that something's going on, lasts for about 90 seconds. So the more you can learn to actually breathe and hold yourself through those 90 seconds, you start to trust that that feeling will pass. But of course, what happens is we feel a feeling, the brain gets involved, it whips up a storm, and before we know it, we've got this like emotion that we can't contain. And that's when we're reaching for things to help settle us down. Really important to see this kind of chain of events that happens, because it's so powerful, and we want to start interrupting and breaking those chains so as this cycle doesn't keep happening. So pause. What is it that you really need, and how can you meet those needs? So that's going to be something you're going to be practicing. So the third aspect of healing emotional eating is prevention and distraction, and I'm going to take you through it's an NLP technique called timelining, where you actually start to get into the habit of, if you've got something that's coming up that you're worrying about, it's called rehearsal and visualization, because the brain doesn't know what's real or what's not real. So the more you can almost talk it through a situation in a calm and logical and rational manner, it's going to start to have some awareness of what's happening. Quite often what we do in situations is we look at all the negative things that can happen, and that starts to make us anxious before we've even embarked on that situation. It's a protective mechanism within the brain. So the third aspect is prevention and distraction, and there's going to be a little technique for you to start working on and practicing called rehearsal and visualization, and it's a really, really powerful it's a brain training exercise. That's what all of this stuff is. You know, there is no magic wand for changing this stuff for you, but it isn't going to come just by reading a book or reading the modules. You have to engage in these techniques. If you want to see change, you have to engage in the techniques that I am teaching you. So things like, you know, working on the good and bad food list, working on the honoring your hunger, working on like noticing the dieting dialect, working on your fullness cues, working on some of the stuff that we talked about last week about noticing physical sensations in your body. And I know it sounds a lot to be doing, but this is how you start to actually step away from the old dieting mentality and actually start to create a healthier relationship with food. So that is this week's training, guys. Healing emotional eating, you're going to have a look at the 3 aspects. So self-care, nurturance and compassion, learning to sit with your feelings, and prevention and distraction. As always, any questions, come and talk to me, and I look forward to seeing your comments.